Word of the Franco-American victory at Yorktown took about a month to cross the Atlantic, and during that time, the Comte de Maurepas' health took a sharp decline. When a messenger arrived in mid-November with the good news, the Comte was on his deathbed. Maurepas' death on the morning of the 21st darkened a day that, for Louis, would otherwise have been a time of jubilant celebration. A significant victory that had broken the back of the British forces in America and sapped their will to fight. It was exactly what he had hoped and prayed for. Thus, in a moment of grief and triumph, began a new era for Louis. Maurepas had been the adviser who, through thick and thin, he had relied upon most heavily. And though not always Louis's favourite, nonetheless there Maurepas was, by the king's side, trustworthy and capable. Well, he was gone now, and so too was the safety net. From here on out, the universe falling in on him, things would start to unravel. The most immediate consequence for Louis, however, was who would replace Maurepas. The kingdom was down a de facto prime minister. Someone would have to fill the void. Well, as it happened, the Austrians had a candidate in mind. When it was known, as far back as the previous year, that Maurepas' health was failing, a cabal of pro-Austrian French nobles and a few Austrian agents, known as the Polignac Group, named after one of the leading families, had set in motion a plan to place a man of their choosing at Louis's side. These machinations bore fruit when Marie Antoinette was induced to join the scheme. She used her influence over Louis to suggest that the Archbishop of Toulouse, Lumière de Brienne, be given a seat at the Conseil du Roi. But Louis, withdrawn and downcast after the death of his mentor, categorically refused to have some unknown priest made a senior statesman. In a council meeting on the day of Maurepas' death, Louis made it very clear that the late statesman was irreplaceable. As it was, the king himself filled the void left behind by the late Maurepas, proving his mettle by rising to the occasion. For the remainder of the American War, Louis personally coordinated the disparate ministries and rival ministers, ably directing French efforts. Still, it was an expensive and arduous war, and so when the British made overtures for peace, they were warmly received. As early as January 1782, the terms of a negotiated peace were being hashed out between the French, British and American delegations in Paris. In the meantime, France still hemorrhaged funds. To staunch the bleeding, Louis delegated some of Maurepas' official duties to Vergennes for the purposes of consolidating the various ministerial budgets into one. As it was, each ministry had its own budget, and protected said budget with a jealous zeal. With a rapidly shrinking pool of available funds, bad news in the budget threatened to leave a given ministry cash-strapped for the next financial year, and thus the budgets were closely guarded secrets. It's also likely that Louis wanted to avoid a repeat of Necker's deceitful compte rendu, a fabrication only made possible by the lack of budgetary oversight. Getting started, Vergennes organised a central committee, the Committee of Finances, to centralise ministerial budgets into one national budget. Much of this work was undergirded by Necker's replacement as Controller General, Jules de Fleury. Since 1781, Fleury had imposed financial oversight, limiting expenditure wherever possible. For instance, he limited the amount of gifts the king could give to his courtiers, a measure for which Fleury made no shortage of powerful enemies. Raising new sources of income, the Controller General reinstituted the widespread use of venal officers. He also ran a few new taxes by the Parlement, gaining some 25 million livres for the crown. He also negotiated an extension for the 20e to 1786, projected to be worth about 21 million livres. And with the war winding down, Fleury also began reining in the naval budget. This brought him into conflict with Eugène Gabriel Delacroix, Marquis de Castries, Minister of the Navy, having replaced Antoine de Sartine in 1780. Castries was an ally of the ousted Necker, but had managed to keep himself afloat. And this is largely because he had a long-term plan for the Navy. Castries believed that the Navy had to be fully funded, even if the war was winding down. As far as he saw it, a future sea war with Britain was inevitable. Thus, he wanted as much as 100 million livres for the first few months of 1783 alone. Obviously, Fleury denied this ludicrous sum. Already he was inundated with letters of payment due for the various shipmasters and suppliers of the navy, all of which were now marked up with 5% interest. With Louis's assent, Fleury refused these payments. So, denied additional funds, and blacklisted by his suppliers, Castries' plans were scuttled. In response, Castries threatened to resign in March. But here Fleury's many enemies, many of them Polignacs, including Marie Antoinette, impressed upon Castries the need to stand firm. Fleury, they said, would back down. And it turns out they were right. Castries then withdrew his resignation. Fleury was absolutely miffed by this, and so threatened his own resignation. Fleury probably meant this as a bluff, but when this bluff was called, he was forced to resign for real. So, oh my god, can you believe it? But we're down a Controller General yet again. Anyway, Fleury's replacement was handpicked by Louis. Partly because the king was fed up with uppity finance ministers, but mostly because the pick in question was a trusted confidant. Actually, for several years, in fact, François de Paul Lefebvre de Ormesson had been something of a de facto Controller General, delivering a biannual report on the state of French finances for the king's personal consideration. Ormesson's opinions were valued by Louis, and so now that a vacancy had appeared, the choice was obvious. The main reason why Ormesson had not been installed years prior was his age. He was only 31, too young for high office. But in the wake of Maurepas' death, Louis was increasingly assertive, and his appointment of Ormesson, while it otherwise might have been scandalous, indicates that the king simply didn't care. To prove that his appointment was not mere nepotism, and in fact well merited, Ormesson wrote up an ambitious project for fiscal stabilisation by 1787, citing the need to reform the kingdom's indirect tax collection system. So Ormesson got stuck in, but attention soon returned to Castries' pig-headed unwillingness to rein in navy spending. Still, he was only delaying the inevitable. When in late May, Castries' second, a guy named Ségur, presented the revised naval budget to Louis, he was met with consternation from the king and from the other ministers, a calculated insult to Castries. The humiliating ordeal was enough for Castries to try to resign, again, this time for real. In the end, Louis forestalled him by threatening to block the career of his young son. So Castries begrudgingly stuck around, but under the king's thumb. Very soon the naval budget was reined in and incorporated into the national budget. This is Louis when he's assertive, when he's willing to be an absolutist and actually crack the whip. Under the king's cover, the Committee of Finances could finalise its work. Unfortunately for everyone, an otherwise successful 1782 was upended in August by a mere oversight from Ormesson. Unwittingly, he leaked details of a confidential arrangement between the Crown and a major Paris bank. The leak revealed that the bank was little more than a front, a means of taking loans at reduced interest. This triggered rapid divestment from the bank and the severing of a crucial line of credit. This lapse in judgment cemented Ormesson's reputation as a bit of an idiot. Unfair, and certainly untrue, but nonetheless a permanent strike against his reputation. Still, Ormesson had his tax plan. This he presented to Louis at a meeting of the Committee of Finances on October 23rd. The main component of his plan was the elimination of the Ferme Généralité, the oh-so-hated and oh-so-entrenched Farmers General. This would immediately eliminate 70 million livres worth of debt the Crown owed to tenant farmers, but more importantly, this would make space for the indirect tax system to be reformed, or better yet, as Ormesson saw it, replaced entirely with a much less regressive system. All in all, a short-term pain for the peasant farmers and noble families invested in the Farmers General. But in the long term, an effective solution to a perennial problem: regressive taxation. Unfortunately, Louis, though inclined to consent to its implementation, was pressured to reject the plan. And really, with hindsight, it's plain to see that Ormeson's plan, no matter how good it was never going to work. There were too many powerful aristocrats with too much money tied up in the system as it was to submit to even the most superficial of modifications. Lobbying to preserve the Farmers General was principally the work of the financial community, but they were backed up by the shady Polignacs, who represented the interests of noble families. Their dual case was made succinctly by a fellow named Bourgard, the banking community's main representative to the crown. He argued that Ormeson's plan would be a killing blow for French credit. Besides which, Ormeson had already caused a devastating bank run, and he couldn't be allowed to do any more harm. Restoring French credit, Bourgard claimed, had to be the central aim of the Controller General, not lofty tax reform. Prodded by the Polignacs, browbeaten by Bourgard, and seeing no alternative, Louis reluctantly compelled Ormeson to resign on November 2nd. Now, as this whole revolving door Controller General business was unfolding, the Treaty of Paris was officially signed. The American War was drawn to a close. Better late than never. In the final stages of the war, since the decisive Franco-American victory at Yorktown in November of 1791, 2 years prior, the war had quietened down on all fronts, that is except on the seas. The French refocused their efforts on the Caribbean, hoping to strike the vulnerable Windward Islands, and began the long-awaited capture of isolated Jamaica. It was not to be so. Left to his own devices, de Grasse was not the calibre of admiral that his predecessor, the Comte d'Estaing, had been. In April, he was dealt a crippling defeat by a reinforced Royal Navy squadron led by an Admiral Rodney. The Battle of the Saints saw 4 French ships of the line sent to the bottom, along with any hopes of fresh conquests in the Caribbean. After this disaster, the French began to withdraw from the war, knowing now that whatever battles would be fought next would be fought at the negotiating table. Well, owing to the debt-ridden kingdom's well-known economic woes and recent reversals, Vergennes entered into negotiations with the British at a disadvantage. His proposals for the post-war division of territory were rejected by all, including the Spanish. King Charles of Spain, remember, had only joined the war to claim Gibraltar, and would not quit until the Rock was under his control. While the diplomatic back and forth continued between all nations, underhanded dealings took place between the Americans and the British. The American delegation, mostly led by John Jay and Benjamin Franklin, undertook clandestine meetings with their British counterparts, and thus came to a mutually beneficial arrangement. The fledgling United States would leave the table with their independence and a vast swath of new western lands to colonize and exploit. Britain would gain a strong trading partner and the rehabilitation of loyalist elements that had fought in the American War. Now, this whole deal cut out the French and Spanish completely. These separate negotiations with each yielded pitifully little. Spain gained Florida, land that was more liability than leverage, and France gained, get this, the island of Tobago and a portion of the Senegal coast. That's all. All of the islands captured during the war were returned. All the potential leverage France had gained by taking possession of these prosperous islands was lost, because the Americans did not want to negotiate as a bloc. And I mean, good on them. By far the weakest party in the negotiations scored the best deal. Well played. But none of this was much consolation for Vergennes or for Louis. The last signatures to the Treaty of Paris were signed on September 3rd, 1783, officially ending the war. The Kingdom of France's gains were far outweighed by the costs. But hey, war's over. Peace reigns. They can get their house in order. Things can only get better from here. No. Louis was in for a very rough November. Vergennes was caught up in a corruption scandal, which destroyed any trust Louis had in his Minister of State, and as we saw, the career of friend and colleague Ormesson was shot through. After the Treaty of Paris, the pact familial with Spain was fraying, and to top it all off, Marie Antoinette suffered a debilitating miscarriage. Oh, and then there was the seemingly never-ending issue of who would become the new Controller General. Well, Bourgard, showing his true colours, made a suggestion. his cousin, a man trusted by the banking community and in league with the Polignacs, Charles Alexandre de Calonne, Comte de Annonville, had been born into the noblest robe. Trained classically and then as a lawyer, Calonne found a permanent vocation in business and finance. Throughout his decades-long career, he was the intendant of Flanders and the procureur to the Parlement there. Later, he was made intendant of Metz and Lille. His sterling reputation as a highly successful intendant was largely due to Calonne's industrialization policies. He encouraged investment from rich nobles by offering subsidies, tax cuts, or other incentives. Anything it took to get new manufactories and workshops up and running. Naturally, this strategy saw Calonne develop a network of contacts among the nobility and banking community. And it was not long until he came under the wing of the Polignac group. He made himself indispensable to them by paying off their debts and generally making a lot of money. Thus, Calonne's appointment to Controller General was the result of nepotism, yes, but also the repayment of this debt owed to him by the Polignacs. Still, he had his detractors. Many in the royal ministry thought a country bumpkin untrustworthy and unscrupulous, and many nobles took offence to Calonne for no other reason than he was a man of money, and they tended to have quite the aversion to that. But nonetheless, Calonne was an energetic, high-spirited man, remarkably spry for his age, and supremely confident in his abilities. Calonne was promptly disabused of his confidence the very minute he assumed office on November 3rd. A single glance at the ledgers was enough. The kingdom lost over 100 million livres annually. Debt was at a simply mind-boggling 4 billion livres. Half of state revenue went directly to servicing debt repayments. And yet Calonne saw no alternative but to continue to borrow to cover the shortfall. This mission was made easier by the Comte Rendu. The residual misplaced confidence that Parlement and the nobility still had in Necker's fabrication made it possible to get them to agree to another slew of massive loans. Between 1783 and 85, Calonne borrowed 488 million livres at a stupendous 8% interest. Despite the fact that this was still compounding national debt, it maintained the illusion of French solvency, and that, to the banking community and the nobility, was what mattered. Over this same period, Calonne implemented his tried and tested program of sweeping industrialization and infrastructural development, just upscaled, kingdom-wide. The sleepy fishing village at Cherbourg was developed into a thriving military and trade port. Paris gained sanitation works, new waterways, and a protective wall. Dozens of mines and manufactories were established, and English investors encouraged to open factories in the booming French market. Many of these developments were funded by the nobility and foreign investment after Calonne assured them all of French economic stability. His assurances, however, were mere theatre, and by 1785 the Parlement were beginning to realise it. When in December Calonne asked for support in taking another 80 million livre loan, he faced immediate backlash. Much of the resistance came from the Grand Chamber, those royalists installed in the Parlement way back in 1771, but who had grown disloyal in protest to Louis's absolutism. As a bloc, they had been poisoned against Calonne, in part by their refusal to countenance more peacetime loans, but also because their president, Monsieur de Amécourt, was in bed with Calonne's chief rival at the time, Louis-Auguste de Brotteaux, former ambassador to Austria and Louis's current Secretary of State. Working closely, but in secret, the two cast doubt on Calonne's claims about the stability of state finances and the serviceability of the national debt. Brotteaux knew that Amécourt wanted Calonne's position, and so a failure for the Controller General would benefit the careers of both men. Louis, however, on hearing that Amécourt refused to play ball, was absolutely furious. The king convened an emergency meeting on the 23rd, held in the Palais Versailles, where he chastised a delegation from the Paris Parlement. As the parlementaires filed out, tails between their legs, after their humiliation, Louis reckoned he had them beat. He fully expected them to aid Calonne going forward, but just to make sure, he removed Amécourt without appeal. An act of unconscionable tyranny that sent shockwaves throughout France. Public opinion of the king took a noticeable dip, and to be honest, this is the beginning of the irrecoverable decline of his public image. Capitalizing upon the king's misfortune, the Paris Parlement threatened to issue an official remonstrance in protest. Their mood on the eve of this threat was adequately conveyed to Louis by his ambassador to them, Maurepas, when he wrote in a letter that he was unsure of the goodwill with those with whom I have to treat. It's fair to say that between Louis's purposeful contempt and Calonne's incredible demands, Parlement's opinion of the king and his ministers was permanently marred, a rift that would never be mended. As Calonne and the king feuded with the Parlement, scandal struck the Bourbon dynasty, sapping the monarchy of yet more goodwill. The Queen's necklace affair, as it was called in the press at the time, had its origins in the reign of Louis XV. The devoutly Catholic king was known to conduct numerous affairs, and lavish elegant gifts and even entire estates upon his favoured mistresses. Presuming that he would be in the market for just such an expensive gift, some enterprising jewellers took the liberty of producing a bespoke, one-off golden necklace inlaid with hundreds of pure white diamonds. The total worth was a mind-boggling 2 million livres. But the jewellers faced a problem. They bet on being able to offload their finished necklace pretty quickly, and so produced it at their own expense. This was a mistake, as it turned out, because Louis died, and the mistress to whom it likely would have gone had fallen out of favour and been exiled. So the jewellers searched the nobility high and low for buyers, but found no takers. Little interest existed for such an expensive piece. Their task grew only more difficult as the years ticked by and fashions changed. The opulent extravagance of the diamond necklace transformed into tacky gaudiness. When they approached Marie Antoinette, politely intoning that she could be the proud owner of this fine piece, well, she flatly refused. No one in France wanted their bloody necklace. All except one. Now enter Jeanne de la Motte, a penniless, unscrupulous young rake of considerable criminal wit. Now technically she was de Valois, distantly related to Henry II. This pedigree gave her a foot in the door of polite society, and she spent her days conning the lords and ladies of the nobility. In this environment, it was not long before she caught wind of the existence of this diamond necklace. It was a golden opportunity. Her plan to snatch the necklace required a dupe. Her useful idiot. Well, she found just such an idiot in the Cardinal de Rohan, a man who, for some time, she'd been sleeping with and picking his pockets on the side. Rohan was thoroughly out of favour at court due to past feuds with Marie Antoinette during his disastrous stint as ambassador to Austria. Thus Jeanne spied an opportunity to defraud both. She convinced the cardinal that the Queen wanted a rapprochement. Rohan took the bait, writing a letter affirming the same. Jeanne offered to be the go-between. Naturally, of course, she never delivered the letter, and instead had her husband, a royal guardsman, forge a response. Strung along for quite a while, Rohan sent hundreds of letters, all of which received fake replies. This budding relationship culminated in a moonlit meeting between he and the Queen. Except it wasn't the Queen. It was a peasant, a shopkeeper, or a prostitute that Jeanne had dressed up to look like the Queen. And in the pale moonlight she sort of, had a passing resemblance. Certainly our decrepit cardinal couldn't tell the difference. As far as he was concerned, he had found in Marie Antoinette an undying friendship. The friendship was, of course, on the down low, and that was the genius of Jeanne's plan. Rohan had a plausible reason to believe that, outwardly, the Queen's apparent hostility to him was a mere ruse to maintain appearances. And of course, he himself dare not reveal that they were now pen pals, for fear of jeopardizing the Queen's position. It was perfect. Rohan really was a gullible old sap, wasn't he? By early 1785, he was so thoroughly ensnared in the lie that Jeanne could spring her trap. She sent letters to the cardinal, apparently from the Queen, asking that he purchase the diamond necklace on promise of repayment with interest. Obligingly, Rohan undertook this task with an uncharacteristic resolve, even going into serious debt to facilitate the purchase. In an intricate deception, Jeanne undertook the pageantry of receiving the necklace and having it officially placed in the care of one of the Queen's valets. A valet who was in fact her husband, just attired in royal livery. Nobody caught wind of the ploy. Together, Jeanne and her husband broke up the necklace and fenced the individual diamonds in London, all 647 of them. And Rohan was none the wiser, even in spite of having been duped out of most of his money. But his suspicions were aroused when he did not see Marie Antoinette wear the necklace at court. At first, Jeanne, still role-playing as the Queen in correspondence, tried to play it off as keeping up appearances. When this didn't allay Rohan's doubts, she claimed that this was because the price was being renegotiated with the jewellers. And when that didn't work, she claimed that it was just too expensive. At this juncture, it might have been smarter for Jeanne to just cut and run. But she didn't. She could not walk away from a hapless little cash cow just waiting to be milked. So she tried to take him for a few thousand livres more, claiming that she, as the Queen, couldn't afford the necklace and needed the Cardinal to foot the bill for the first instalment. But Rohan had spent every last livre he had on the initial purchase. Dumbfounded but still bone-headed as ever, he dutifully complied, fully expecting the Queen's interest to come due soon. But it never did. Months went by and still no repayments. So the Cardinal went to a royal financier in August, and he took one look at the accounts and the record of purchase and surmised that Rohan had been played for a fool. When Marie Antoinette received word of the trickery, she bristled at the prospect that she would have A. reconciled with Rohan, and B. been so foolish as to ask him for money, much less the necklace. So at least initially, there was an attempt to conclude the affair behind closed doors. In a personal audience with the King and Queen, all Rohan could offer in his defence was his sincere apologies. The letters that would absolve him of guilt he kept concealed for now, hoping to avoid the embarrassment of airing them. This, of course, generated great suspicion that he himself had fabricated the entire plot to steal the necklace. Certainly, the Queen thought as much, and she managed to convince Louis. Rohan was arrested, but not before having his servants burn most of those letters. Whilst he was incarcerated in the Bastille, the Conseil de Roi met to determine Rohan's fate. Marie Antoinette, never before a part of these meetings, essentially oversaw them in this exceptional case, insisting that it was her right as she was the one most closely affected. After a heated back and forth, she eventually forced the Conseil to offer Rohan a choice: a public trial or a closed-door special tribunal. Fatefully, Rohan chose the public trial. This meant that the whole affair, which before was just rumours and gossip, exploded out into the limelight. For weeks, it dominated gossip and the tabloids of not only Paris, but all of France. From polite society all the way down to peasant farmers, everyone was entranced. For his part in the affair, Rohan was viewed charitably by the people, nobles and peasants alike. He was innocent. A buffoon, yes, but an innocent one. When Jean Delamotte's intimate involvement was revealed by a thorough investigation by the defence, public opinion likewise favoured her. She was viewed sympathetically, a down-on-her-luck, reluctant rogue forced to resort to deception. Her husband and the Queen impersonator were both acquitted at the trial. Jeanne herself was imprisoned in Paris, but later escaped. Rohan evaded punishment by a narrow margin, 23 votes to 26, but he ended up exiled anyway. In the end, the whole affair did wonders for the public perception of the perpetrators, but absolutely tanked the reputation of the Queen. Yes, that's right, the Queen who had quite literally no involvement in the criminal aspects of the affair, had earned the undying enmity of the people. Before the trial, Marie Antoinette was, in the common imagination, either a tolerated artifact of the Franco-Austrian alliance, or a haughty snob. Afterwards, though, well, whatever goodwill or apathy existed towards her evaporated, replaced entirely by unbridled anger and widespread condemnation. She appeared to all a precocious, stuck-up schemer. And, to be fair, she was, but other accusations were a little bit below the belt. A fixed feature of the pre-revolution that lasted well into and past the revolution itself was the potent influence of conspiracy theories. And after the diamond necklace affair, The Queen found herself at the centre of a spider's web of contrived conspiracies and heinous plots. Claims abounded that the Queen was nothing more than a plant, a conniving Austrian spy in league with foreign saboteurs. For now, though, we return to Calonne, still embroiled as he was in the battle to restore French credit and assuage the national debt. In the same position as Necker and Turgot, two figures whom he had vociferously derided, Calonne, ironically enough, came to the exact same conclusion that they had. Because he couldn't count on the Parlement to let pass another loan, the only remedy for skyrocketing debt and looming bankruptcy was sweeping systemic reform. In secret, the Controller General compiled a programme, which he soon delivered for Louis's consideration on August 20th, 1786. Calonne's proposals were organised into 5 points, and included reforms to the administration aimed at decreasing expenses, reinstituting Turgot-esque free trade policies, the reduction of clerical land rights, modifications to the salt and tobacco taxes, and then finally a universal land tax, intended to replace the VATM. Now this land tax was very important. It would be paid in a percentage of annually produced foodstuffs, not necessarily money, and so would alleviate the financial burden borne by the rural peasantry. The exact amount owed would be determined by regional assemblies, but new assemblies, that is, ones that would replace Necker's old conservative ones. Calonne, foreseeing that these assemblies could be dominated by the hostile regional clergy and nobility, proposed equating voting power with the amount of tax provided, meaning that those with the most voting power would be those who contributed the most. A neat little way of incentivizing paying more tax and disempowering the first and second estates. Now I think you can already tell that all of Calonne's proposals were radical. Extreme, even. In essence, it was a total repudiation of the basis of the money-making structures of the Ancien regime. It would impose uniformity, subject all estates to the same tax laws, enforced equally, and take no account of status or wealth. Thus, there was no way that the 5 points would pass by the Parlement. Not only did the Parlement hate the king and Calonne, but the land tax in particular would prove highly objectionable, as it would directly eat into the income of the parlementaires. But not to worry, as Calonne had a cunning plan. Louis could go over the Parlement's head and register the 5 points with an assembly of notables. An assembly of notables was just what it sounds like. A collection of important business leaders, mayors, politicians, nobles, clergymen, luminaries, officials, you name it. Knowing that, left to outside influence, the assembly could consist almost entirely of anti-absolutists, parlementaires and clergymen, Calonne would make sure that members were disproportionately drawn from the Third Estate, bolstered by royalist sycophants from among the nobility. It would be their job to discuss the 5 points, debate them in an environment not immediately predisposed towards rejecting them out of hand. Calonne's presumption was that they would essentially rubber-stamp the 5 points, leaving Parlement to register them legally as something of a fait accompli. Now this, of course, was highly unorthodox, and had the ugly hue of absolutist tyranny to it all. Parlement would not like it one bit. But even if they refused to cooperate, they could be compelled by a lit de justice. Over the next few months, Louis expressed his concerns. While he had signed on to the 5 points wholeheartedly, he wondered aloud about the need for an assembly of notables at all. He believed, quite astutely, that it set a precedent that reforms required popular consent, which ran counter to his deep-seated absolutist convictions. He also wondered if forcing the issue would alienate or enrage the clergy and nobility. After all, the clergy, who were completely untaxed, and the nobility, stood to lose a lot of income. Would turning them into powerful enemies really be worth it? Calonne's answer was brief. Be resolute. Match strength with strength. Well, Louis certainly took this mantra to heart. In the lead-up to the assembly, many Parlement did all in their power to block, obfuscate, or delay the royal plan. Using his powers, the king singled out the Parlement of Dijon, and later the Parlement of Bescanon, for some rough reprisal. Their presidents and other prominent members had their positions in the Assembly of Notables revoked and were compelled to return home. The king would brook no dissent. The notables began to convene at the end of December, their work scheduled to begin in January. But delays kept coming. Not only had Calonne fallen ill, no doubt from a good few all-nighters, but on the 13th, tragedy struck. The Comte de Vergennes, architect of the French effort in the American War, had spent his long days advocating Calonne's 5 points and making the royal case for reform. These endeavours, however, drained the frail septuagenarian of strength, and he expired after a lengthy battle with illness. His passing, while mourned, was overshadowed by the Assembly of Notables, which finally began on February 22nd. They met in the Hôtel des Menus de Plaisir in Versailles. Louis presided, sitting above proceedings on a velvet throne. Below him were some 144 notables, consisting of many high-ranking nobles such as the Comte de Provence and the Comte d'Artois, in addition to senior clergymen and dozens of parlementaires. The king opened proceedings with a succinct address, calling on the notables to weigh Calonne's proposals carefully, bearing in mind the parlous economic situation. Concluding his speech, Louis retired, yielding the floor to Maurepas, who gave his own short speech. His speech was perfunctory, forgettable. It was clear for all to see that Maurepas' heart really wasn't in it. After him, Calonne came forth. After reminding the notables that the king had granted his personal approval for the 5 points, Calonne jumped right in with an in-depth accounting of the state deficit. The following day, the notables first grappled with the 5 points. Great pains had been taken to keep the details of the points a secret. So many notables were hearing about the 5 points for the first time. Divided into 7 working groups, they got to work. Responses varied wildly, but they were almost universally negative. Necker still had shooters among the parlementaires, and they refused to consider the proposals of one of Necker's rivals. Moreover, they objected to notions of free trade and demercantilization. Maurepas, showing his true colours, played footsie with these detractors, making things immeasurably worse. Nobles were alarmed mainly by the land tax, and picked it apart by making a broader point about taxation in general. And this move was spearheaded by none other than the Marquis de Lafayette. For his part, Lafayette, having returned from the American War, saw this as a perfect opportunity to leave a mark on the French political scene. Why change things now, he asked. Was it not unseemly for the king and his ministers to sign on to proposals that so brazenly undermined the Ancien regime? Though the need for reform was generally accepted, the brunt of that reform, the nobility argued, should not be borne by the upper classes. Of course, extraordinary times called for extraordinary measures, but no amount of discussion could convince many among the nobility that it was their duty to pay tax for the crown's benefit. That was the peasantry's job, it was argued. The objections of the clergy rhymed with those of the nobility. Archbishops and priests provided the staunchest, most incorrigible resistance to reform. Rage emanated from each as they railed against the assault upon their ancient rights and privileges, supposedly safeguarded by the king. None were more adamant in their opposition than Lumière de Brienne. Yep, that Brienne, the Queen's favourite, whom she had failed to install on the Council de Roy. Well, he's back in the picture now, arguing that taxes and the regional assemblies were intolerable impingements upon clerical privilege. It was primarily on issues surrounding the land tax that the battle lines were being drawn, and Calonne knew he was on the losing side. By the end of February, he thought the writing was on the wall. There was no way that the notables would agree to it. So he wrote to the king requesting that he intercede on the tax's behalf. This Louis did. Deliberations on February 28th were preceded by a written order from the king which stated that the land tax was universal, and no one would be exempt. Argue all you want. That was the king's will. Unfortunately, this didn't diffuse the situation. Louis had been fairly hands-off for the first week, but became more involved going forwards, even organising meetings between Calonne and delegations from the Parlement, the clergy and nobility. But no real compromise was achieved this way. This left Calonne seriously isolated. Oftentimes an incredulous Controller General became fed up with the notables, and derided them with sarcastic retorts. If it was not for Louis's continued confidence in him and the 5 points, the Assembly of Notables would likely have ended here as a dismal failure. But like I said, Louis was becoming intimately involved, and working hand in glove with Calonne. He even edited a series of avertissements, basically editorialized pamphlets, meant to be published for public consumption. People will pay more, without doubt, but who will? Only those who have not paid enough in the past. They will pay what they owe according to a just proportion, and no one will be overtaxed. Some privileges will be sacrificed, yes. Justice wills it, and necessity demands it. Would it be better to overtax the non-privileged, the common people? There will be great objections. That has been anticipated. Is it possible to work for the general good without offending some private interests? Is reform impossible without complaints? These were Calonne's words, but tempered with Louis's pen. Now obviously, it was calling out those notables who were refusing to play ball. This appeal to the people, however, didn't pan out, and failed to generate any real public pressure on the notables. What it did do, however, was completely destroy Calonne's reputation. The notables used it as proof of the Controller General's ill will towards them. Even Louis was not spared. Castries challenged the king, insofar as that was possible, and petitioned him to distance himself from Calonne and the avertissement. Heading into April, things started to escalate. Maurepas, parroting the parliamentary case against the 5 points, accused Calonne of sensationalism in the avertissement, and of deliberate obfuscation of ledgers, a not-so-subtle allusion to Necker's compte rendu. Former finance ministers Necker and Fleury were offended by notions that they had worsened the deficit, and with their concerted efforts contradicted official records. Calonne was not out of ideas, however. He submitted again for the king's aid, and issued an account review of the finances from Necker's time in office, a middle finger to the pro-Necker elements among the notables. He also offered to make minor but symbolic concessions that limited the universality of the land tax. Whatever Calonne wanted to do, however, hinged upon the king's support, and that support was wavering. Voices raised in protest against Calonne were growing louder, more numerous, and harder to ignore. And with all the crap floating about in the press, Louis was beginning to doubt Calonne's numbers. He also fell prey to a lie perpetuated by Maurepas, that Calonne was conspiring to dismiss the Assembly of Notables before their work was complete. If this was true, it couldn't be ignored. When Louis confronted Calonne, the Controller General quickly shot down the accusations and issued an ultimatum: me or Maurepas. Openly, Louis sided with Calonne. After all, Calonne was the only other member of the government who really believed in the 5 points as strongly as Louis did. Lenoir, the Minister of Police, was tasked with digging up dirt on Maurepas and his allies. He quickly determined that there was evidence of a conspiracy to hinder Calonne's efforts. A swift council purge followed. Maurepas got the sack on April 8th. Calonne's arch-rival, Bretagne, went with him. Castries was given the arse too, replaced as Secretary of the Navy by Admiral d'Estaing. Other ministers were fired, thus removing all roadblocks against reform from the Concerto Roy. But Calonne suspected that the king's goodwill was evaporating, and that he too was on the chopping block. In the days leading up to the purge, attempts to meet with Louis and discuss further concessions and strategies were turned down. The king cited Easter celebrations, but Calonne knew the truth. Louis always refused to see in person those whom he was about to dismiss, hoping to avoid the awkwardness of the confrontation. For his part, Louis still believed in the message, just not the messenger. Even as Maurepas was under investigation, he had resolved to dismiss Calonne too. The case for reform would become Louis' and Louis' alone. Match strength with strength. The king's guiding hand, equal parts force and finesse, was required to subjugate the Assembly of Notables. Calonne was in his home in Versailles on Easter Sunday when a knock sounded at his door near midnight. A fellow minister unceremoniously delivered a letter from Louis. Without appeal, Calonne was immediately dismissed from his post and exiled to his estates in Lorraine, far, far from Versailles. Another one bites the dust.